Are you coming to the tree with a strong upper man? The same murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. This is take number 3. My cat Roswell has decided that now would be a good time to sing the song of her people, and she wanders about my recording studio just screaming at the top of her lungs. So this is try number 3, minus one cat who is now confined to the kitchen. Hopefully this time all goes well. It's easy to discount a UFO sighting when only one person is involved and they're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Even when there are photos or videos, folks will say it's all CGI or a hoax of some kind. If you have a bunch of witnesses, it makes the nasty, noisy, negative naysayers work harder to debunk. Instead of trying to understand what folks are seeing in our skies, they want to explain it away by either attacking the witnesses or simply ignoring them. Here are a few stories where a bunch of witnesses all saw the same things. In 1959, Papua New Guinea was still a territory of Australia. A June of that year saw a spectacular sighting by Father William Gill, an Australian Anglican missionary, and 37 members of the Benoi mission. Gill made notes about the experience which the media obtained. The stories appeared in August, causing a sensation. Back then, they spoke a bit different. Their use of words and the descriptions sound a bit odd, especially since these witnesses are from Australia. And let's face it, here in the United States, people in Australia do sound a bit unusual. Only the day before the sighting, Gill had composed a letter to Reverend David Dury, acting principal of St. Aidan's College in Dagura, to accompany a report regarding a UFO sighting made by Stephen Moy, an assistant teacher at Gill's mission. The letter said, "Dear David, have a look at this extraordinary data. I am almost convinced about the visitation theory. There have been quite a number of reports over the months from reliable witnesses. The peculiar thing about these reports is that the UFOs seem to be stationary at Benoin or in travel from there. The Mount Pudai vicinity seems to be the hovering area. I myself saw a stationary white light twice on the same night on April 9th, but in a different place each time. I believe your students have also cited one over Benoit. The assistant district officer Bob Smith and Mr. Glover have all seen it, or similar ones on different occasions, again, over Benoit. Although I think the Benoit people said they watched it travel across the sky from our direction. I should think that this is the first time that the saucer has been identified as such. I do not doubt the existence of these things. Indeed, I cannot now that I have seen one for myself. But my simple mind still requires scientific evidence before I can accept the from outer space theory. I'm inclined to believe that probably many UFOs are more likely some form of electric phenomenon, or perhaps something brought about by the atomic bomb explosions, etc. That Stefan should actually make out a saucer could be the work of the unconscious mind, as it is very likely that at some time he has seen illustrations of some kind in a magazine, or it is very possible that the saucers do exist, but it is only a 50-50 chance that they are not Earth-made, still less that they should carry men, more like radio-controlled, and it is still unproven that they are solid. It is all too difficult to understand for me. I prefer to wait for some bright boy to catch one to be exhibited in Martin Square. Please return this report, as I have no copy, and I want a Reverend Norman Crutwell, to have it. Yours, Doubting William, Anglican Mission, Benoin, 27/6/59. They also put the day before the month. A lot of folks will hear from a friend or an acquaintance a story about a UFO sighting, which is believable, but not anything like seeing a UFO for yourself. I hear sightings from people all the time. I believe they saw what they're telling me about. I've seen a few UFOs myself, so I have my own experience to go by. My sightings have all been just lights up in the sky, but when somebody says that they've seen a saucer or a disc, I have no reason to doubt them. The following day, Gil went from believing his friend to seeing for himself. When he got home, he sent another letter to his friend David. Dear David, life is strange, isn't it? Yesterday I wrote you a letter, which I still intend sending you, expressing opinions about the UFOs. Now, less than 24 hours later, I have changed my view somewhat. Last night, we at Benoit experienced about 4 hours of UFO activity, and there is no doubt whatsoever that they are handled by beings of some kind. At times it was absolutely breathtaking. Here is the report. Please pass it around, but great care must be taken, as I have no other, and this, like the one I made out from Stefan, will be sent to Nor. I would appreciate it if you could send the lot back as soon as possible. Cheers, Convinced Bill. Gil had seen a bright white light in the northwestern sky. It appeared to be approaching the mission and hovering about 300 feet above the ground. As he stood there watching this strange craft, he was joined by other people who all watched the flying craft. Eventually 38 people, including Gil, teachers Stephen Moy, Ninas Rarata, and Mrs. Nestle Moy, gathered to watch the main UFO, which looked like a large disc-shaped object. It was solid and circular, with a wide base and a narrow upper deck. The object appeared to have 4 legs underneath it. When Lonnie Zamora had his encounter on April 24, 1964, near Socorro, New Mexico, he had told the experts the craft had 4 legs. The experts immediately denounced him, saying no one would build a landing craft with 4 legs. It would always be a tripod, 3 legs. Then NASA built the lunar lander with 4 legs. Back in New Guinea, there also appeared to be about 4 panels or portals on the side of the object, which seemed to glow a little brighter than the rest. At a number of intervals, the object produced a shaft of blue light which shone upwards into the sky at about a 45-degree angle. The folks watching this flying craft spotted what looked like a group of 4 men standing on top of the craft. There was an observation deck of some kind with a rail around it. The men stood by the rail looking down at the people on the ground. They looked as if they were dressed in shiny black one-piece outfits, making some of the witness think it had something to do with scuba divers. The blue light was turned off, then the men began to go back inside the craft. Once the deck was clear, the UFO moved away into the clouds. The following night, June 27th, the craft came back once more. Gill was there watching the sky when the flying saucer was once again seen. He said, "Large UFO first sighted by Annie Lowry at 6 p.m. in apparently the same position as last night, only seemed a little smaller. When WBG saw it at 6:02 p.m., I called Ananas and several others, and we stood in the open to watch it. Although the sun had set, it was still quite light for the following 15 minutes. We watched figures appear on top, 4 of them. No doubt that they are human. Possibly the same object that I took to be the mothership from last night. 2 smaller UFOs were seen at the same time, stationary. One above the hill west, another overhead. On the large one, 2 of the figures seemed to be doing something near the center of the deck, where, occasionally bending over and raising their arms as though adjusting or setting up something not visible. One figure seemed to be standing looking down at us, a group of about a dozen. I stretched my arm above my head and waved. To our surprise, the figure did the same. Ananas waved both arms over his head, and then 2 outside figures did the same. Ananas and myself began waving our arms, and all 4 now seemed to wave back. There seemed to be no doubt that our movements were answered. All mission boys made audible gasps of either joy or surprise, perhaps both. As dark was beginning to close in, I sent Eric Kadawara for a torch. Well, that would be a flashlight here in the United States. And I directed a series of long dashes towards the UFO. After a minute or 2 of this, the UFO apparently acknowledged by making several wavering motions back and forth. Waving by us was repeated, and this followed by more flashes of the torch. Then the UFO began slowly to become bigger, apparently coming in our direction. It ceased after perhaps half a minute and came no further. After a further 2 or 3 minutes, the figures apparently lost interest in us, for they disappeared below decks. At 6:25 p.m., 2 figures reappeared to carry on with whatever they were doing before the interruption. The blue spotlight came on for a few seconds, twice in succession. Gill had described how he and the mission people called out to the men, even shouting at them, beckoning them to descend, but there was no response beyond what had already been noted. 2 similar UFOs higher up remained stationary. By 6:30, the scene had remained largely unchanged, and Gill recorded that he went inside for dinner. Critics were quick to question this, saying, why would somebody walk away from such an extraordinary sighting? Gill said he's asked that question a lot. Having had 4 hours of this sight on Friday night, we were not nearly so interested when it returned on Saturday night, especially after we were not able to persuade it to land. You must also keep in mind that there was nothing eerie or otherworldly about any of this. It was all so extraordinary, as ordinary as a Ford car. It looked a perfectly normal sort of object, an Earth-made object. I realized, of course, that some people might think of this as a flying saucer, but I took it to be some kind of a hovercraft the Americans or even the Australians had built. The figures inside looked perfectly human. In fact, I thought they were human, that if we got them to land, we would find the pilots to be ordinary Earthmen in military uniforms, and we would have dinner with them. At 7 p.m., the larger craft was still present, although it appeared somewhat smaller, either due to distance or perception. The group of observers went to church for evening song. After the church service, visibility was very limited, with the sky covered in clouds. Nothing else was seen that evening. At 10:40 p.m., a very penetrating, ear-splitting explosion woke up people at the station. It sounded like it had come from just outside the windows of the mission house. Gill felt it did not sound like a thunderclap. Nothing had been seen, but the whole sky was overcast. Other, less compelling activity occurred the following night. Then it seemed the Benoit visitations were done. Reverend Gill was at the time of his sightings already scheduled to return to Australia. This presented the civilian groups an excellent opportunity to assess the credibility of his reports. All investigators found Gill to be very impressive. This led to one of the leading civilian groups, the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society, to view the Gill report as constituting the most remarkable testimony of intensive UFO activity ever reported to civilian investigators. They were unique because the first time credible witnesses had reported the presence of humanoid beings associated with UFOs. The major civilian groups of the day, in a spirit of newfound cooperation, inspired by the significance of the Benoit observations, distributed copies of Gill's sighting report to all members of the House of Representatives of Australia's federal parliament. A letter accompanied the report, signed by the president of the participating civilian UFO groups, urging members of parliament to press the Minister of Air for a statement about the attitude Air Force intelligence had to the New Guinea report. November 24, 1959, in federal parliament, E.D. Cash, a Liberal member from West Australia, asked the Minister for Air, F.M. Osborne, whether his department had investigated the reports. The minister's reply did not address this question, but instead focused on general situation, indicating that most sightings of UFOs were explainable and that only a very small percentage, like maybe 3%, of reported sightings of flying objects couldn't be explained. A representative of one UFO group was advised by the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence that the department was awaiting depth of evidence on the New Guinea sightings. A typical political answer. Not an answer, but a lecture on whatever subject the government wants its constituents to believe. The world would be a far better place if, when asked a question, the folks in government would actually answer it. It turns out the department had not even interviewed Gill. Eventually, the Minister of Defense requested a report of the RAAF, that's the Royal Australian Air Force, interview Gill on December 29, 1959, 6 months after the sightings. Gill's recollection of the visit is that the two officers from Canberra talked about stars and planets, and then they left. He heard no more from them after that. As one might expect, Gill's account was dismissed by the RAAF, despite its extraordinary nature and the number of witnesses. The senior interviewing officer, Squadron Leader F.A. Lang, concluded, although the Reverend Gill could be regarded as a reliable observer, it is felt that the June-July incident could have been nothing more than natural phenomenon colored by past events and subconscious influence of UFO enthusiasts. During the period of the report, the weather was cloudy and unsettled with light thunder storms. Although it is not possible to draw a firm conclusion, an analysis of rough bearings and angles about the horizon does suggest at least some of the lights observed were the planet Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. Light refraction, the changing position of the planets relative to the observer, and cloud movement would give the impression of size and rapid movement. In addition, varying cloud densities could account for the human shapes and their sudden appearance and disappearance. Typical. Back during World War II, when airmen began reporting sightings of what became known as the Foo Fighters, the High Command sent a few investigators to look into the reports. They did their best to insult and berate the witnesses to a point that nobody seeing these weird flying craft would send a report forward. Just think what would have happened had the Foo Fighters actually been Nazi secret weapons. The war would have been lost because the guys looking into the reports started off with a closed mind. I have a few ideas why the government acts the way it does when interviewing UFO witnesses. Either they really think everybody not in uniform are a bunch of idiots who can't determine the difference between a planet and a flying saucer, or they already know what is flying around the skies, but they don't want us to know what they are. Over the years, there have been a number of explanations put forward to account for the Benoi sightings, including astronomical misidentification, hoax, cargo cult effects, and that Gill had myopia and astigmatism, and this had been the case of anyone wearing glasses would not be considered a reliable witness for anything. Just because the person wears glasses doesn't mean they see things. Most recently, there was an attempt to explain the whole affair away by suggesting that Gill and the other witnesses were confused by a false horizon and that they had been watching was a brightly lit squid boat and a crew that was too busy to do more than just wave at the people on shore. This idea is not tenable when one realizes that Gill was certain the object he saw was at a 30-degree elevation in the sky. A more radical attempt to dispose of Gill's case came from UFO skeptic Daniel Cohen in his book Myths of the Space Age. Over the years, there have been many so-called skeptics that went out of their way to debunk UFO reports. As time went by, we discovered some of these people were actually working with or for the government. It would seem these folks are trying to further the government's story on how only crazy people see UFOs. It all drops back into the plate of the Brookings report from 1953. The Benoi visitations are enshrined in a classic piece of Australian fiction. Randolph Stowe's 1979 book Visitants, which has the Benoi visitation as a backdrop to a story of confrontation, emerged from Stowe's experience as a cadet patrol officer in Papua New Guinea. By mixing a true story into a work of fiction, the story becomes confused as to whether it was real or just a story. It makes some folks believe the whole thing was just made up. In 1973, J. Allen Hynek visited Australia and Papua New Guinea, and he found 6 of the witnesses to the Benoi event. They all supported Gill's version of what had happened. Hynek and Alan Hendry, the center's chief investigator, concluded the lesser UFOs seen by Gill were attributable to bright stars and planets, but not the primary object. Its size and absence of movement over 3 hours ruled out an astronomical explanation. In 1966 in Australia, there was another UFO sighting that involved a bunch of people. This time it took place over a school. In Melbourne, at the Westall High School, there were somewhere around 200 witnesses. The witnesses ranged from the youngest kid at the school right up to the headmaster, what we would call the principal. April 6th, some of the kids were outside playing in the schoolyard. Others were still inside doing all the things required of kids while locked up inside. It sounds kind of like prison. Actually, some prisoners have more rights than kids, but, well, that's another show. The sky was clear and visibility was good. Out of nowhere, a huge silver disk came into view. They said it was about the size of 3 cars combined. This was the 60s, so we're talking about big old land yachts, maybe 25 by 25 feet. Seeing something that many had said didn't exist caused the kids to gather around and look. The staff were also mesmerized by this bizarre craft. As it landed just a short way from the schoolyard fence. Kids ran to the fence and began jumping over, heading to the wooded area where the craft had set down. The staff tried to get the kids to come back, worried there could be some danger from this unknown disk, and being responsible for anything that might happen to the kids in their charge. Kids being kids, many kept going, wanting to see for themselves a real live flying saucer. The saucer was on the ground or close to it for about 20 minutes. A few kids ran inside spreading the word that there was a flying saucer just outside. Soon a lot more kids were outside looking at the craft than were still inside doing their work. One of the girls got too close to the craft and something knocked her unconscious. I wonder if this was anything like what happened to Travis Walton. I hope not, because had the UFO not taken him away, he might not be with us today. Was this girl unconscious or in far worse condition? The craft lifted back into the air and sped away. A group of jets came rushing from the nearby airbase and followed the path of the fleeing saucer. The girl was still out, so an ambulance was called for. Now here there are conflicting reports as to whatever happened to her. Some say she was discharged a short time later, while others say she vanished, never returning to the school. The grass where the craft had landed had a depression pressed into it. The kids had to be herded back into the school and sent to their classes. They were told the police would be there shortly and wanted to talk to them all. The police came and talked to a few of the adult witnesses, and then the headmaster of the school called for an assembly to discuss what had happened and to tell the students what they saw was not an extraterrestrial craft, but something man-made, like maybe it was a weather balloon. I wonder just how stupid people were supposed to have been back then that nobody could tell the difference between a flying saucer and a weather balloon without somebody having to explain it to them. The kids were all told to not repeat what they had seen that day to anybody. Think about that. You just saw a weather balloon, but don't tell anybody that you saw a weather balloon. Really a great way to do things. That flying saucer you saw, it wasn't real, and don't talk about it with anyone. And trust us, we know what is best for you to think and do. At the same time, the teachers at the school reported that two men in dark blue suits had come and talked to them about what they had seen. They were also told not to discuss what they saw that day, especially with the press. One of the teachers, who had grabbed her camera and snapped dozens of pictures of the saucer-shaped object, said she was taken aside by the men in suits. They took her camera and said this was now their property. She also said that the men were from the ASIO. The Australian Security Intelligence Organisation is Australia's national security agency responsible for the protection of the country and its citizens from espionage, sabotage, acts of foreign interference, politically motivated violence, attacks on the Australian defence system, and terrorism. A science teacher at the school, Andrew Greenwood, was later visited by officers at his home who threatened him to not discuss anything that he had seen under the Official Secrets Act. If he did, they would have him fired and discredit him by releasing rumors of him being an alcoholic, even though he wasn't. These guys were a lot like the MIBs here in the States. They would still be MIBs, only in blue instead of black. The press from the event was minimal, but the Dandenong Journal, man, who in the heck came up with that name? Dandenong Journal covered the story and interviewed as many people as would come forward, which ended up with a front-page story. They also looked into the witnesses' accounts of airplanes chasing after the UFO. According to commercial and military records, there were no planes in the area at the time, even though well over 200 people had seen them fly by. In one of the reports I read, there were two schools close together where the saucer had landed. One would have been a grade or grammar school, and the other a high school. We didn't have middle schools back then. You went into high school looking like a bunch of tiny little kids surrounded by these monsters. Kids being kids, the 7th graders were the targets for a lot of nastiness. The area where the saucer had landed was inspected by both the police and the military. Several witnesses say once the area had been scoured by a lot of men, the authorities set the grass on fire, burning away any evidence they may have missed. The school kids and staff weren't the only witnesses. People working in the area saw the saucer as it hovered over the wooded area before it set down. A few saw it take off as well. They all agreed the saucer went straight up and then shot away, being followed a few minutes later by what looked like military aircraft. Well over 200 people of all ages saw a flying saucer over the school. About 50 or so actually saw the craft sitting on the ground in the wooded area. One girl was knocked to the ground by some unknown force, and the government said it was just a weather balloon. Sue Savage, who now lives in Springvale North, was 13 at the time of the encounter. She was in science class at Westall High School when a fellow student ran into the classroom shouting, "There's a flying saucer outside." Mrs. Savage said she and her classmates went out to the corner of the schoolyard and they looked up in awe. She said the UFO was like two saucers, one on the bottom and one turned upside down on the top. Some people say there was just one, but I recall there were three. They were hovering over the trees and then went down into the trees and disappeared for a minute or two, then rose back up and sort of banked onto the side and then took off at 1,000 miles an hour. Now, who's calling? Okay, didn't need that. I would edit that out, but right now I'm having extreme difficulties with my editing program, so I'll just leave it in. You all know what a phone ringing sounds like. Mrs. Savage said the encounter left a lasting impression on her. Since then, she's been a keen interest in astronomy and astrology, and UFOs have to deal with many skeptics. Mrs. Savage said it makes her mad when people tell her she was mistaken. It was just a balloon. She says yes, she was young, but she wasn't stupid. Mrs. Savage said it made her feel like people were thinking she wasn't all there. The grass was pushed down in either one big circle or three small circles. There were depressions in the dirt caused by the landing gear. The police or the military destroyed any evidence. September 14th, 1994, a flying saucer was spotted in the sky over Pier House School, about 25 miles from Ruwa, Zimbabwe. Around 100 kids were in the schoolyard, and they all saw the craft. It was silvery and round, and it looked like it was about to land. After a few minutes, the flying saucer moved away, vanishing from sight over the horizon. While the craft had been in view, all the radios used for communications around the school and the buses went out. It wasn't until after the saucer was well out of sight that the radios all began to work again. On the morning of September 16th, 1994, there was another group sighting at the school in Zimbabwe. The aerial school was in the countryside away from any big cities or towns. It had about 70 students and 15 staff. This school was 25 miles from the first encounter. The staff were having a meeting inside, and all the kids were outside in the schoolyard being supervised by one adult. 62 kids were witness to a flying saucer that hovered right over the school for a few minutes before it landed in the trees nearby. As they watched, a small man, about 3 feet tall, suddenly emerged from the round object. The children would later describe him as having extremely thin body, long black hair, and very large black eyes. He jumped down from the craft and began walking in the direction of the fence where the kids were watching. Another alien creature stood on top of the saucer, looking around, kind of like a lookout. They were both dressed in form-fitting black suits. The description of the aliens in black sounded a lot like what had been seen in Papua New Guinea. The small aliens were in sight for several minutes as the kids all stared. The alien then was walking towards the kids, stopped and looked at them. The kids all stared back. This was when the kids all said they felt as if they were being communicated with, but only in their minds. This contact seemed to last for several minutes. Then the alien walked back to his saucer. He clomb inside along with the lookout, and the craft left, going back up into the sky, and flew away. Some of the children would run into the school crying. The area was rich with legends of demons and evil entities, and some of the young children were convinced that this was what they had seen. The older children, still unnerved, were experienced a little more, and they thought that what they had encountered was telepathic communication with the entity that stood in the field in front of them. Many of them knew what a UFO was, and that's what they had seen. The teachers inside the school were dragged from their meeting amid the commotion. One of them would later state, "We just heard them screaming and screaming. A child can't make that up." Another would offer, "I was very skeptical in the beginning, and that while they believed what the children were saying, they'd seen something, but we didn't think it was a flying saucer." The headmaster at the school also believed the children's sincerity, but initially thought it was best to just let the matter go and not talk about it. Following the weekend, however, the school began to receive phone calls from the parents of the kids that were involved, each one asking the same question: what had happened that frightened their children so much? Realizing the matter required investigation, the school contacted Cynthia Hind. Cynthia Hind would be the first UFO researcher to speak with the kids. After hearing what they all had to say, she invited UFO researcher Dr. John Mack to investigate as well. From Hind and Mack's efforts and immediate documentation, the encounter is one of the most detailed and credible on record. The pair would interview the kids one by one. Each kid told pretty much the same thing. They all agreed the silvery craft looked like a flying saucer. It hovered over the school for a few minutes. Then it had landed amongst the trees. There were two aliens, short with big heads and almond-shaped eyes. One of them stayed at the craft while the other communicated with them through its eyes. Have you ever tried to get two kids to agree on anything? How about 62? There were a few inconsistencies, small details that one or two told that didn't line up with all of the others, but these were very small items, like how big the craft was or whether it was behind one or two trees. Many of the kids said they were hearing or seeing things inside their minds coming from the aliens. Things like how technology was bad for our world and it would lead to death and destruction. Many of the children who had telepathic communication from the dark figure had some interesting revelations. One witness described the experience as, all of a sudden it was just like images going through my head. A message, telepathic communication. Another child told Hind and Mack that the aliens had arrived to tell us we don't look after the planet properly. Another even darker view came from another witness. They said they received images in their mind of the end of the world where all the trees would go down and nobody would be able to breathe. The two investigators had the kids draw pictures of what they had seen. The pictures all show basically the same thing. A saucer-shaped craft with creatures in all black with big heads and almond-shaped eyes. The BBC bureau chief of Zimbabwe, Tim Leach, also met and interviewed most of the children who had witnessed this bizarre event. He stated that the incident and the accounts of the children who witnessed it gave him a new perspective on life, the universe, and everything. Where have I heard that phrase before? Life, the universe, and everything. That's the ultimate question. The answer is 42. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you must be reading the wrong kinds of books. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is my favorite book, and I've read it 5 times. It's not actually a book, it's a trilogy of 5 books. I know a trilogy is 3 books, but Douglas Adams started out with a trilogy and he just kept on going. The case still intrigues UFO researchers and enthusiasts today, over a quarter of a century later, and is truly one of the most credible and thought-provoking UFO accounts of recent history. Cynthia Hind, along with Dr. John Mack, would speak to the children individually. Each would share the same details. In Mack's opinion, he was convinced of the children's sincerity and the authenticity of the case. He stated of the witnesses, they described these events like a person talking about something that has really happened to them. He was equally convinced the children were of sound mind, not a mass hysteria event. It is important to remember that a majority of these children, if not all, would have had little to no exposure to UFO encounters in any great detail. With the internet still several years away, even television was far from a large platform. In short, it is unlikely that all 62 children aged between 6 to 12 years old would have concocted and maintained such a deception. Unfortunately, Dr. Mack was killed by a drunk driver while attending a lecture in London in 2004. He was not only a respected UFO and alien abduction researcher, he was a Harvard graduate and an experienced psychiatrist. When he began to investigate alien abductions and released the book Abduction, many of his colleagues tried to distance themselves from him. There was even a movement to have his credentials revoked. The dean of Harvard eventually performed a review, and he reaffirmed Dr. Mack's academic freedom to study what he wished and to share his opinions without impediment. I wonder why so many folks who consider themselves highly educated think it's wrong for people to believe and look into UFOs. I would say, look for the money. These academicians all receive grants from who else? The government. Is the government paying these people to put pressure on everybody else trying to keep the UFO studies away from us tax dollars and only in the hands of the military? Mack's contribution to alien abduction phenomenon is invaluable. The fact that he would so strongly back the genuineness of the witnesses in the aerial school incident should tell us of the authenticity of the account. Using all of his professional skills, both as a UFO researcher and a psychiatrist, he would state that the children's voice, tone, and body language were so consistent that it was obvious they were telling the truth. They told their stories with such conviction. He would highlight how one child claimed the alien figure had spoken inside his mind that the human race should not be so technologized. That's how it's spelled. As an example of the bizarre authenticity to the claims. That's got to be a made-up word. What's more, at least one of the children who witnessed the incident at the aerial school had even seen something strange in the sky overhead earlier and had joked with her friend, "Oh, look, a UFO," before saying, "Oh, it must be an airplane." As she still noted to herself how strange and like a cigarette the object was. Only later, when the events at the school unfolded, did she begin to think seriously that what she had witnessed that morning was the same object that had just landed near the school. The kids described the aliens as being dark, almost like shadows. Could there be a connection between aliens and shadow beings? The long hair fits in with sightings of the Nordics and the Pleiadians. Both of these alien beings are described as having long hair. The kids said that the craft that had landed made a weird sound like a scary flute being played. People report hearing sounds in the sky like flutes and trumpets all the time. The sounds are called skyquakes by some. A few kids said after the saucer had come and gone, the stories were going around a bunch of men showed up to examine the ground where the craft had landed. No one knows if these were from the police or the military. They walked around amongst the trees looking at the ground and occasionally scooping down and picking things up. None of the kids were allowed to go near the landing site, and nobody knows really who these men were. Not only did the teachers struggle to believe what the children reported that morning, but many of the children's parents also dismissed such wild tales. When they were asked during a documentary about 18 months after the incident how they felt about people not believing them, Aside from the expected answer of sad or being frustrated, one child said it makes you think it might not be true. The 62 kids not only agreed on what they had seen, they never changed their stories. They stuck to what they had seen. The descriptions and the drawings were the same. John Mack had had the kids draw pictures of what they had seen, and just about every picture is the same. What is interesting about this particular incident is the connection to the environment. One child who made such claims when pushed by Mack stated that such thoughts had never occurred to her before she witnessed the man on the disc-like object. She said they came to her hours later when she was at home. However, she was also very specific in stating that the man had put those thoughts in her mind. It isn't the first time that such environmental issues have surfaced in close encounters and alien abduction. However, the connection between the Earth's environment, our use of technology, and alien visitation one day might prove to be, if something interesting or important. It's not a good idea to ignore what the UFOs and the aliens are saying. Many UFO researchers, including Mack, suspected that the issue could be very well lie in the heart of the UFO and alien question. One witness, Emily Trim, stated almost 2 decades later that this sound was like a high-pitched frequency, quickly followed by a flash before the craft appeared. She also stated that she could not be certain in terms of time as to how long the incident had lasted, as she was referring to that flute music. Emily Trim said the telepathic images started coming into her mind, something she would further describe as communication through the eyes. This is an intriguing description. Is eye-to-eye contact important in such telepathic communication and the transfer of images that surfaces in numerous abduction encounters and other close contact incidents? Sarah, another of the aerial UFO witnesses, said not only does experiencing and speaking of such an encounter brand you for the rest of your life, but it also leads to a permanent fear of these things returning one day. As she continued during an interview with the Mail and Guardian that she could sense when the aliens were back in our atmosphere. I've heard from other folks with alien encounters who say after their initial meeting, they knew when a UFO was going to reappear. They would sometimes hear a voice telling them to go outside and to look in a particular part of the sky. They would almost always see a UFO there. As Sarah also said, it hadn't been for Cynthia Hind coming to the school to interview the kids and then having John Mack come as well, nobody would have ever heard about the flying saucer that landed in front of 62 kids in broad daylight. The whole incident would have been written off as just their imagination. One of the kids, whose name is not being released, said she would dream about seeing the alien in her room and it would take her away at night. There's no record of any of the other kids having such late-night encounters. It could be they just don't want to talk about it since they've had such bad reactions from seeing a flying saucer as a group. Or maybe they don't remember having these personal encounters. A documentary that came out in 2020 goes into a lot of personal encounters from all over the world. It's called The Phenomenon by James Fox, and it's narrated by Peter Coyote. I like that, Fox and Coyote. They interview a bunch of politicians who mostly want to talk about themselves, but there are military witnesses, and in the last part of the show, the kids from the Ariel school are interviewed. Expedition Unknown also had a visit to the school along with James Fox. They got to interview a bunch of the students that had seen the flying saucer. They still are telling the exact same story. One person seeing a flying saucer, and the naysayers claim the witness is drunk or crazy or lying. 1 or 200 people seeing a flying saucer, and the naysayers either ignore them or they try to pretend they are all confused and can't distinguish between a weather balloon and a flying saucer. Even now that the Pentagon has thrown us a few scraps, really nothing earth shattering, the naysayers are still trying to convince us there are no UFOs or aliens, or it's simply too far and they can't possibly be going from there to here and back. They talk as if the aliens get in their little flying saucers and they fly back and forth each day. I guess they don't want to consider the fact that there could be a mothership, perhaps parked at the bottom of the ocean, or maybe the far side of the moon where we can't see it. Maybe it's inside the moon. After all, there have been plenty of people saying that they've seen things coming and going from the surface of the moon. And don't forget when the Apollo 14 mission, they crashed the lunar lander back onto the surface of the moon after everybody was out. They said that the moon rang like a hollow bell for several minutes. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, let the friends and relatives and the people that you meet on the street know what they're missing. If you're standing in line at the grocery store waiting to check out, just turn to the person behind you and say, "You should listen to Strange Things with Chris James." They'll probably look at you like you're nuts. Maybe that wouldn't be a good idea. If you enjoyed tonight's show, you can catch all the archives on iHeartRadio. All 260 shows are there now. You can also find them on YouTube. Until next week, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.